I don't know if the media per se has hijacked shame. I think that ideologues hijack shame regularly. You know, you saw this, for example, under the Maoists in particular, where they used public shaming constantly as an ideological tactic. And so now, to the degree that the media, let's say, whatever that is now, is complicit in pushing an ideological narrative forward, you know, and maybe the postmodernists would argue that you're always pushing an ideological narrative forward no matter what you're doing. They're participating in the harnessing of shame for specific political ends. And, well, if you believe, like the postmodernists do, that the world is nothing but a stage of competition between different groups who are competing fundamentally for power, then there's no way out of that. But I think that's an unbelievably dismal view of the world. I also think part of the reason that there's an alternative media growing, particularly on YouTube, is because there are ways of presenting information that aren't precisely ideologically motivated. Now, it's tricky because you have to have a framework through which you look at the world in order to understand the world. And it does tend to be a narrative framework, because narratives tell you how to get from one point to the other. And human beings are always getting from one point to the other. I mean, we're alive, that's what we do. And so this is something Jean Piaget, a developmental psychologist, pointed out. In some ways, the truth is not so much a set of facts, although there are forms of truth like that, as a process. And the people who are popular on YouTube, Joe Rogan's a good example, is he brings people in and they have a discussion. And the truth is actually in the process of the discussion. And the reason I think Rogan works so well is because he's actually trying to learn something when he's talking to his guests. He isn't driving forward his a priori notions. He has them, because everyone does, but he's looking to expand them and transform them during the conversation. And so the truth of the conversation isn't so much in the conclusions as in the dialectical process by which those conclusions are generated. And people actually really like to listen to that. So when I lecture, for example, because my lectures have become quite popular on YouTube, I'm not telling people what conclusions I have drawn, although I can't help but do that to some degree. I'm trying to extend my knowledge of the topic while I'm lecturing. And so what that enables people to watch is the process by which new maps of the world, that's a good way of thinking about it, come into being. And that's very exciting for people. Well, that's what we do in a conversation like this, if it's a real conversation. You know, we're trying to figure out what's going on, rather than to state categorically, this is what's going on and these are the people behind it. It's like, well, no, we can toss out hypotheses, we can try to figure it out, and that's what makes the conversation engaging and interesting. A lot of these new interviewers, let's say, run very long shows. They're not sound bites, they're not clips, they haven't been run through the production mill, and actually people on YouTube don't like that sort of thing. They like it raw. There's lots of people on YouTube, like Girl Says What, Karen Strawn. She just sits at her kitchen table and talks, and there's a bit of editing, you know, to get rid of the ums and that sort of thing, but you get the whole thing. You get to draw your own damn conclusions. And I think that's, we were talking a little bit about truth. It's like, if you're a journalist, see, this journalist came and did a story about me in a magazine called Toronto Life last year, eh? And he did quite a bit of background research, and the article was actually pretty well researched, but he couldn't resist the temptation to tell his readers what to think, you know, and so he had some opinions about me, and they weren't particularly positive, and so he'd lay out some of the background information that he had gathered, and then he'd tell the readers what that meant. And the piece came out, and I wasn't very happy with it, and so I wrote him and I said, you know, like, kudos on your background research, and why the hell didn't you just let the readers make up their own damn minds? You don't have any trust in your journalistic ability, you don't have any trust in your audience, so you wrote a propaganda piece. Now you might say, well, you can't help but introduce your biases, and of course to some degree that's true, but you can present, see, the world's too complex to describe completely. And so you have to lay a structure on it in order to simplify it. And you might say because of that there's no way of getting at the truth, because you have to lay this structure on it and simplify it. But that's actually not technically correct. Like, imagine that, because when you simplify the world, you're basically compressing it like a compression algorithm. And if you use an unbiased compression algorithm to represent a set of data, then you sample equally from the entire data set. You don't take all the data, but you sample equally. And then you get a representation of the whole. It's an accurate representation, it's just not as detailed. Well, that's sort of what you want to do as a journalist, to the degree that you can. You know, and partly you understand that you have biases, so you talk to people who have different opinions. Or maybe you even figure out what the different opinions are and make them strong and address them while you're telling the story. And to say that you can't do that is, well, I think it's deeply and insanely cynical, because it also means, if you can't do that, it also means you can't communicate. You know, if there's no truth, why do people talk to each other? What the hell's the point? We wouldn't communicate if there was no way of communicating truth. It would be pointless. The postmodernists tend not to admit, in some sense, to the existence of the objective world. You know, and I think that's fundamentally a complexity issue, is that there's a world that exists beyond our comprehension of it, and so that's the simplification problem. But the problem with the consensus theory of reality is that, well, there are obstacles in the world that you bump into regardless of your damn consensus. And so you can argue that that's not the case, but it's futile. I mean, because you learn in your own experience that there are elements of reality, even within your subjective experience, that your interpretive structure can't lay a hand on. You can't argue yourself out of being hungry, especially if you're really hungry. You can't argue yourself, sometimes you can't argue yourself out of being in love, even if you know it's the wrong person. You can't, and fundamentally, you can't argue yourself out of pain. You know, and that's why I think that the ultimate truth, in some sense, is that life is suffering. It's like, good luck laying down an ideological overlay on that. Like, you can adjust your pain to some degree through thought, you know. It is malleable to some degree, but not in the final analysis. And so arguing that the world, that a separate world of constraints beyond your interpretive framework doesn't exist is, it's futile, it's not going to work for you, and B, you never act that way. You know, people who talk about science as, say, a patriarchal Western construction, you know, they're making observations that the scientific method is, first of all, to some degree, a consequence of the subjective interest of the researcher. Fair enough. And that researchers are subject to ambition like everyone else, and hey, absolutely. But part of the scientific method is the competition of ambitions and the decision through the competing ambitions about what actually constitutes the shared ground of experience. And you might say, well, I don't believe in any of that. It's like, yes, you do. You use computers, you fly on airplanes, you drink filtered water, you participate in the technological society. And you, by participating in it, you indicate your assent to the ontological presuppositions and the epistemological presuppositions upon which it's based. And you might say, well, no, I don't. And I would say, well, who cares what you say? I'm going to watch how you act, and as a better indicator of your fundamental truth. And there's no reason to assume whatsoever that what you say and what you do are in alignment. Like, they might be, but often with people they're not in alignment at all. So, and the postmodernists are a classic example of that. They wouldn't turn to Marxism otherwise. You know, because the postmodernists say, well, there's no grand narrative, everything, in some sense everything is a matter of contextual interpretation. And then that leaves them with nothing and nowhere to go. So the Marxism comes in as a substitute for that. Or maybe even the postmodernism was just a rationalization for the Marxism to begin with. It's not obvious from the historical record. But they don't act out their claims because they can't. So this post-truth idea that's a demonic idea, really.